Hi, I'm Alexis.
And I'm Kim.
And this is the Whatcha Watchin podcast. And today we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves. I keep wanting to call it Honor Amongst Thieves, but that's not what it's called.
The title's
Tetris.
already too long.
Exactly. It's like 47 words. It feels like an emo song from 2004. We're going to talk about Tetris, and we are going to talk about Air. So we will just jump in since we already started about D&D, the longest title in the world. Let's just jump in. Kim, what did you think of Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves?
Well, my initial qualm was that this was the longest title imaginable. I was writing on this and Shazam, I think, the same week. But all of the exclamation points and I'm so tired of the colons, the hyphenated titles. Let's go simple again. But let me prefix this by saying I'm not a D&D player. So I don't have the level of love for this story that I know a lot of people out there have. I left this wanting more. I think what I initially started picking up on. So you've got this incredibly rich, talented cast. Chris Pine is, all things delightful as he is. Hugh Grant, I'll get more on that later. Hugh Grant in there, Michelle Rodriguez. What is it? Justice Smith?
Smith, I think.
Yeah. Incredibly talented, incredibly interesting cast. And then you have John Francis Daly and Jonathan Goldstein in there, who are two of our comedy writing and directing mainstays really in the 21st century here. Game Night, they directed. I love Game Night. Horrible Bosses is theirs. I have a guilty pleasure in my heart for that movie as well. As I watched this, I found myself picking up on, I think, their creative sensibility throughout. I could see it. It was all this, so much about this movie was right there. It was so close, but yet I found it so far. I came out feeling like this was such a family film. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I hear that. I know some people out there will really appreciate that. It's accessible and it's fun and it's easy. It's so family oriented. They could have taken an extra step and let it have been a little darker, a little bit more of a sense of humor, a little edgier. And I think that was what I wanted, that left me kind of a little deflated at the end of this movie.
I agree with you on that. I think it felt very PG-13.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm with you on it's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it's great if you have a movie that you can bring your kids and everybody can enjoy it. But I do kind of wish there was a little bit more of the how in the 90s you'd have a movie for kids, but there's the hidden adult jokes in there, or the things that are for parents.
The Rocky and Bullwinkle of it all.
Yeah, it could have had a little more of that going on. But I was really pleasantly surprised by this movie.
Mm-hmm.
I went in feeling I thought this was going to feel like the Rock kind of Jumanji type of those very cynical kind of, hey, we're cashing in on something.
Mm-hmm.
Where everyone just felt like they were there for a paycheck, and it felt like, yeah, here, we're milking this IP. And instead it was everybody was really everyone seemed like they were really having fun. The whole movie had a really fun tone.
Mm-hmm.
And just the charm of Chris Pine.
Yeah.
Everybody it just felt like the best word I could use is just fun. It was a fun movie, and I was not expecting it to be that fun. I was expecting it to either take itself way too seriously, or to be very feel like the Emoji Movie, or feel like just this very cynical kind of IP cash grab thing.
Cynical cash grab, completely.
Yeah. And I was shocked that it didn't feel that way. Yeah.
If anybody could play a roguish scoundrel and sell it, Chris Pine has a lock on that character.
Totally. He is so charming all the time. There's not 5 seconds where this man is not just where you're oh, That charisma. He's so charismatic every second.
He's my favorite Chris. I will
admit,
he is my Chris.
I think he might have become my favorite Chris. Yeah. People sleep on Chris Pine, I think, because, you know, we got the Marvel Chris's and stuff. And then it was like, hey, wait a minute. Like, another Chris has appeared. And we all need to, you know, put some respect on Chris Pine, because this is like, he's legit. He's totally legit. Like, my previous favorite Chris was probably Hemsworth. But I feel like with Chris Pine, I was like, I think you might have slid into the number one Chris spot with this movie. He's just so charming.
In this, he's very much in Captain Kirk territory, and Captain Kirk, he's kind of stuck in that role a bit. But as he ages, he needs to start landing some good work, and I think he can. He's got the skill to. Hell or High Water shows it. He was my favorite part of Don't Worry, Darling, and I shouldn't even get started on that film, but he was the good part in a not good movie. He can find some really interesting parts to weird characters, and he's got something there. He's got some real talent.
And then I was really impressed with Michelle Rodriguez. I liked it so much because I feel like she's so good at that kind of like badass tone that can sometimes feel one note, but the one note was perfect in this, in the sense where like it just really fit with the character. And then the contrast with her and Chris Pine was great.
I am usually not big on her. She's there. I don't know if I've necessarily liked a lot of the films she's been in, but that character, I agree, was a real pleasant surprise for me. And that was a moment where I was watching it where it's like, okay, this isn't, they're using her well. This is, I don't dislike her in this film. I don't dislike this movie.
This movie shows like a weird restraint that I don't think you would find in a more cynical, cash grabby kind of movie, where they're just sort of more preoccupied with telling a fun story than sort of just being like reference, here's a thing. And I also have not played D&D. I've watched a lot of like, there's various comedians and stuff that I've watched play it. The Whitest Kids You Know did like a really, really long D&D thing during the pandemic that was seriously one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. I linked it in my review because I was like, this is so good. Like, it's The Whitest Kids, so it's very inappropriate and very like adult, but God, it was so funny. And that's probably my like biggest experience with D&D was literally just watching them do like 15 hours of a campaign. But I love that this is a movie that can work for if you've never played or if you are really familiar with it.
Well, and I know that was where I even had to mention this in my review when I was writing about it, because there were moments throughout where I was the only one not laughing in my row. So it was clear where I was like, okay, this is a joke I'm not in on. Totally. This is something for the players. This is something for, innate into this universe, whereas I had no idea. And honestly, where that divide is going to be from me going, it was fine, to the people going, I loved it, give me more.
Yeah, I think there's probably like an extra star tacked on for people who have all those references and stuff. But certainly I was so pleasantly surprised, and by the whole cast, really.
Hugh Grant is doing something really interesting. He was a crush of mine. It's Four Weddings and a Funeral was a formative movie for me. Notting Hill was a formative movie. To see him taking these leaps and playing these weird, interesting, villainous, colorful characters now is so cool to see that he's willing to have fun, because it's clear here he doesn't know what the hell's going on. He has no idea. Hugh
Grant's never heard of an owl bear. Yeah, so he's doing orcs like Michael Douglas did ants. Like, that's what we're doing. There was a lot of like the humor in this was kind of they had a lot of very like broad kind of everybody can relate to it humor, but I really liked that it felt very like a Guardians of the Galaxy type of thing, where there are your sort of broad everyone's gonna laugh jokes, and then there are the more like thoughtful jokes. I loved what's it, Regé-Jean Page from Bridgerton. I've never watched Bridgerton. He's gorgeous, so I probably should watch Bridgerton. But he was fantastic. I loved, like, it's essentially Drax, where it's like he doesn't get sarcasm and all these things. But I think he was really nailing that. And the combination of him and Chris Pine, it was giving me that when Thor meets Star-Lord in the Avengers, and there's that sort of tension of like, well, actually, I'm the coolest guy here. Yeah. Like, it was totally giving me this very Guardians vibe, and I loved it. I was like, this really works here. So it was really fun.
Because I've never watched Bridgerton either. And I think I had the exact same reaction where it's like, maybe I should. I've seen about 5 minutes of one episode, and that's a whole different story. But he was great. He comes kind of out of left field. He's a late addition, but that is such an interesting character that I wouldn't have expected from a young, hot up-and-comer like that. And yeah, he plays incredibly well off of Chris Pine. He gives Chris Pine a lot to do, really, too, because he allows Chris Pine to kind of find that insecurity a bit, and that a scoundrel like him is not necessarily going to have. So they fill their roles nicely, I thought.
Well, let's jump into spoilers for a little bit, because I want to talk about cameos that are in this. A certain cameo that I thought was pretty funny, and a few other things. So spoiler warning. Let's talk Bradley Cooper.
I'm watching this going, is that Bradley Cooper? Like, how did I miss them? What is happening here? What universe did I enter into?
I loved again, it's played so seriously for something so silly with him and Michelle Rodriguez. I was like, I love this. Like, it was a really good, like, the fact that he's like this person who broke her heart, and he's like just this tiny dude, and then he's got another like tall, huge barbarian woman that it's like, oh, hey. It was great. I loved that. I was like, that's such a nice, like, these are those little kind of like throwaway bits that, like, it doesn't really do much to the story. I mean, it gives her a little bit more depth, but it's like, this is just because it's fun. And I thought that was wonderful. I loved that cameo.
They play off incredibly well together. It's perfect for her character because it shows some humanity that you don't necessarily get to see in other cases. And then, yeah, that reveal that he's got another wife he's clearly got a type, and it's Michelle Rodriguez. It was perfect.
I also loved, like, and it's, again, another kind of throwaway bit, the whole thing with Jonathan, where they're like, okay, we have to tell this story to like the parole board. And Chris Pine just keeps being like, yeah, I just really would love to tell this story to Jonathan. I just think that would work a lot better. And you just keep being like, where is this going? And then when Jonathan walks in and he's like an eagle guy or something, like, I'm sure, again, I don't know the term for it. I'm sure this is D&D term for it. But I loved that as like, it's such a, like, it's a joke that does nothing other than just be a really solid joke. And I loved it. I thought it was so great. I was like, this is such a funny moment. And what a good way to start out, where they're kind of letting you know this is the tone we're going for right from the beginning. It was really effective.
Well, and that's Daly and Goldstein too. That shows the confidence there, because they stretch out that joke for a while. That scene keeps going. You're waiting, and it keeps. They let that play, and it works. And that it was, part of the things there. That was it's like, that's their tone. That is these two skill.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I think the confidence that you mentioned, like, that is something that I think is so impressive about this for me. They were doing pre-screenings of this movie like weeks before the movie came out, public screenings, like inviting D&D groups and people like Amazon Prime members and all these things. And it's like, I feel like we don't often see a movie where they feel that confident that they have a good movie. And it's no surprise that this movie is doing really well at the box office, because they really did come into it with the confidence of like, this is going to work.
There's a confidence there because they're coming at it from a place of love and respect. I think if you come at this is a big game. This is a big IP. This has heavily invested people in it. If you come at this from a place of cynicism, if you come at this from a point of making fun of them, you aren't going to have the success. This needs to be made by people who love and understand the subject matter. And I think that comes through.
Let's pivot to Tetris. We also both saw Tetris. Apple, it's on Apple right now. So what did you think of Tetris?
I dove into this one hard. This movie for me had a hard time finding its footing. It is very, if you love video games, it's going to be something there for you. But the first, I'd say 2 acts are very inside baseball. They play this movie up as a political thriller, the real story of Tetris and going behind the Iron Curtain. For 70% of this movie, it's video game rights, it's handheld publishing rights, it's coding discussions with a very, very general light term of commies, am I right? Because it's set in the 1980s. This was held together by solid performances. We know Taron Egerton is great. Rocket Man, he put out a decisive claim that he is one of his generation's best up-and-comers, and we're going to see more of him. I thought that Russian cast was incredibly great, a little underutilized. Nikita, I'm gonna butcher it.
Is it Efremov?
Efremov is good. Yes,
okay.
Efremov. Yes, that at least works phonetically. He is incredibly solid in there as well. We've talked about this on Twitter. He was my call out for the best part of the film because I found he was the heart of the film.
Totally.
He was the heart. He was the emotion because he's got so much more at stake than everybody else could just go home.
Yes.
He's Russian. He's kind of stuck there. Just fun performances, but very slow until if you don't have any investment in gaming or the history, until it becomes a full-fledged political thriller at the end of Act 2, it's a long time to get there.
I'm with you where, Alexi as a character is so much more compelling, I think, than most of the rest of the characters. Just because he, like you said, he is the heart of it. He has more invested. He has more of an emotional journey going on where you're like, wow, he's this like brilliant guy who's come up with this thing, but he's so like stifled by everything around him, and everything it's just like he's living in this like miserable world. But he could be doing so much more and has all this potential and has all these ideas and all these things. And that is totally the character that you get like really invested in. It starts out really slow. That kind of slow pace is to the detriment of the movie because it is easy to kind of check out by the time it starts to get really interesting. Right. Russian cast, absolutely fantastic. Like they really were great. I was feeling very like Hans Landa vibes from our KGB guy. I was like, I expected him to just like go full Christoph Waltz and just start giving us like a speech while drinking a glass of milk or something. I was like,
loved
this is
that
great.
Performance. I wanted more from that character. That script let him down.
It was just kind of like, he's a bad guy. Here he is, menacing bad guy.
Twirling his mustache.
Yeah, and he could have had a little more sort of meat to him. They got a little hung up in that like, but Dad, you're going to miss my dance recital kind of thing. And I feel like that's so tired of like, business parent who can't be around for their kids because they're doing something that's going to change the world. Like, that
those
feels
two are
tired.
Those two are both executive producers. And I had to call that out in my review. I had a big question, and I am not studied on this history here, but having Hank and Maya's now the CEO of Tetris, having those two being on as producers, they're telling their story.
Yeah.
This is their family. This is their family history. Yeah. How did the perspective change and shape that? As soon as I saw their names in the credits, I was like, huh.
Yeah.
How would this have been done if this wasn't Tetris's
property,
movie.
basically.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
totally. I didn't mind the stuff about the coding, but it is funny how much of this story is basically video game licensing rights.
mhm.
And it almost reminded me of like Star Wars, where you have all the talks of like treaties and trade disputes and all that. And you're like, yeah, but the lightsabers, like I think this started to kind of fall into that territory. If you are old enough to have had a Game Boy and to have played Tetris,
I
you
did.
probably are old enough to be like, oh, interesting, video game licensing rights.
I was really reminded of War Games watching it, a movie that's about just the technology. You have to love. I mean, I had the Game Boy they showed. I mean, I had a Game Boy in probably like 92. I played Tetris.
Totally.
But yeah, it's less about the the whole political thriller of it all that I know I had in my head going into it. So it's more about just literally that technology. The gentleman who played the head of the Russian security agency or wherever they were interacting, that guy was doing a ton with very little story. And I think if they would have honed in a bit, it was almost
like too many villains occasionally, because you had like the billionaire guys who are trying to sort of get the rights and they're just arrogant and awful. Then you had that Stein guy or whatever, Toby Jones, who was just like, he was also this weird middleman.
He was like, underutilized too.
Yeah.
Toby Jones is always good.
Yeah, it was basically like, okay, we have like 6 people that are fighting over the rights to this game. And you probably could have boiled it down and just said like, okay, it's Russia and it's Hank and it's Alexi, and you probably didn't really need all that other stuff. I'm sure in real life that was, all of those things were factors, but it did feel a little like, okay, so this is a villain, and then this is a villain, and then this is a villain. And it was kind of like there wasn't enough focus on any one villain. And I think that was where, the main KGB guy, the like, primary Hans Landa kind of guy, like that guy could have been the main villain of the story. But because there were like 6 villains, we couldn't really get enough of any one villain to feel like particularly challenged by that villain. I did love though that there was an airport scene that totally reminded me of the airport scene in Argo, where it's like really tense with like, will they get out of there and all that. And I loved that. I thought, wow, like this is an actual like really exciting moment. And the movie had a lot of slow points up to that point. So to see something where I was like, ooh, good tension here. Like I'm genuinely like really like, ooh, okay, what's gonna happen? Are they gonna get it out? Oh, are they gonna make this work? We just need a ticket to anywhere. And they're like rushing through the airport and trying to do this stuff. Like that was great. And I kept thinking like, that's cool. But again, it's like one part of this larger thing that is not that exciting for most of it.
Well, that's in that third act. That's when it's fully committed to the paranoid political thriller type, the trapped behind the Iron Curtain.
Totally.
Point. And no, that was incredibly good. That was tense. I did not know where they were going to go. And then it's like, oh, hey, okay, I see what they did. But that is when the movie is at its strongest. Totally. I would say definitely that last 20-25 minutes. Hank could be such a cowboy boot wearing. He is so the type to be, I'm the American.
Totally.
And Edgerton does not do that. He finds a nice human note in there, but I almost feel like, again, he's only the focus because Hank and Maya are producers.
Yeah.
You're exactly right in that there's just too much going on.
Yeah, it probably should have been a movie just about Alexi, really. Like Alexi probably should have just been the main protagonist of this story. I think it would have really landed a little better. We would have had a lot more emotional investment, because a guy getting licensing rights to Tetris is not as exciting as a guy, crushed by the weight of the Soviet Union and trying to sort of break free of that. It's a more compelling story. So I think in that sense, it's like, that's where, again, like, oh, these are the executive producers, so that's what we're getting. This probably could have been a little better if the focus was shifted more toward Alexi as like a character.
Well, in the linchpin, there's one point where I think he says, and I know Hank says it again later, he is the one person, Alexi is the one person who does not stand to profit from this game.
Totally.
But yet he's got the KGB knocking on his door. He's got the KGB following him. That's your protagonist there.
Totally. Yeah, I agree.
And he sells it.
Well, let's talk about Air. I mentioned Argo. That's the pivot. Mentioned Argo, Ben Affleck. From Ben Affleck, we're going to go to Air.
Sticking with the 1980s nostalgia bombs.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think you and I had slightly different opinions of this movie. I will say it's hard for me to be unbiased and be like, oh, a movie about like 1980s basketball. Like, I'm going to come into this from just purely a reviewer perspective. I just think like there's no way for me to do that. So I was into it because I'm like, okay, this is already really exciting. We're talking about like 1984 basketball. This is like a very formative time in my life in terms of like, I was born, my dad was
say a formative time.
Exactly. Literally a formative. My dad was working for CU and, involved in a lot of this kind of stuff. So I was like, oh, okay, this is really exciting. This is like, I've heard stories about these things. So for me, I think right off the bat, I was immediately like very prone to liking this movie a lot. But I am curious about your perspective as not coming into it with all the sort of backstory stuff. What did you think of Air?
I mean, my basketball, I'm not a big basketball watcher. My basketball experience, I did a lot of the dream team years. So 94 to 96, that was kind of my basketball era.
Totally.
So Larry Bird, and so these names were all familiar. Stockton comes up a lot. You see Larry Bird. But that's kind of where my basketball ends. I haven't watched much of it lately. This one, I got in the weeds. I will admit that. I will preface this, and I've said it a few times. I didn't hate it, but there were choices that Ben Affleck makes as a director that I'm not sure I quite understood. And going into this, I don't even know if we need to say spoilers. They got the shoe.
It's history. Yeah, it's like
Air Jordans exist. Exactly. They got the shoe. First of all, I think the performances are the main thing that needs to be talked about here. I mean, and this is a solidly A-list cast. I mean, Damon is Matt Damon. Viola, I think, is once again a force. We need to talk about Viola as just being capable of walking in and saving a film. Because as she does all of the heavy lifting, because they make the interesting decision to de-emphasize Michael Jordan in a Michael Jordan story. And I got very distracted by how throughout it's the back of Jordan's head or Jordan staring at a wall. And I think, unlike Tetris, where Tetris took shape for me in the last act, I think I was there through Air until the last act, when they go into the Nike meeting and you see Michael Jordan acting like a sullen teenager and facing the wall.
The last like 20 minutes of the movie, it kind of reminded me of like an Adam McKay movie where you have those kind of like little insert to like, and here's how this went, and here's the news, and here's this thing, and here's whatever, like in a way that didn't match sort of the earlier parts of the movie. I wish that more of the focus was on Viola Davis, because I think she is 100% the MVP of this. But I am not a Matt Damon fan. Yeah. I think he's he's a fine actor and stuff, but yeah, I'm not like, I am not the biggest Matt Damon appreciator. So much of the focus being on him was a little like, I didn't love that. But I really loved Ben Affleck in it. I think Ben Affleck is one of
He
those
was
people.
funny. I will say he was funny.
People tend to like hate Ben Affleck performances
Mhm.
and things. I remember when The Last Duel came out and everyone was like, "Oh my God, Ben Affleck's so terrible in this. He's playing like a bro." And I'm like, "But that's the point. I like him playing a bro. That's kind of like that's the point of this role, is to make you
He's
think
good
about it
at
like
it.
yeah, like it was to make you think about this in the context of our world now and all that. And I
Mhm.
thought like that was great. And I loved him in this too, because it's like he was really funny. And but in not like a trying to be funny kind of way.
Mhm.
He found humor in the character more so than
Mhm.
like in being jokey. Like Jason Bateman, I was like, okay, this is great. I liked his role. He had a little more kind of like heartfelt moments, inspiring speeches that were kind of delivered really well. So I was impressed with him. But yeah,
Bateman was at his best when he was with
yes,
Bateman. I called
totally.
out Bateman as my other MVP
Hmm.
because Bateman at least gives some scope to the fact that Damon's betting the house here.
Yeah.
Sonny's putting a lot of people in jeopardy here with this. And Bateman's the only other one that really gets a life outside of the office.
Yeah.
You,
Who
you
else I
hear
was
about his
really
family.
Yeah, that's true. He does get kind of like there's a little bit more going on.
Mhm.
I was also really impressed with Chris Tucker. It was nice to see
Yes,
him.
it was
Like
nice to have
it's
him
been a
back.
while, and I felt like he also had a role where he was able to give us some heart. He was able to
Mhm.
really kind of like he kind of connected it with like why this matters on a personal level to the Jordan family. So he was kind of the thing that made it less of just the, hey, we're here to be a big corporation and slap this guy's name on
Yeah.
something and make money. He was the one who really carried the, and this is why this matters, of the story. So it
Mhm.
was great to see Chris Tucker. I was like, hey, Chris Tucker, he needs to be in more things. It's wonderful. It's been a while. Like, I'm glad to see him here. And then like
I
Marlon Wayans coming in. It was funny to me as
yes.
somebody who's like watched a lot of movies in the 90s with like hip hop kind of movies, to see Chris
Mhm.
Tucker, who was in Friday, and then Marlon Wayans, who was in Don't Be a Menace, basically playing the character that Chris Tucker was playing in Friday. I was like, oh my God, my like 90s brain is like exploding in this.
It made me feel so old
Yes.
because I was immediately transported. I've seen Chris Tucker. I immediately went, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?" I went back to Rush Hour.
And you're like, oh, that movie was like 5 years
It's,
ago. And then you're like, oh God, it wasn't. It was so long ago.
and then I look at Matt Damon, who I had a crush on in the night. Ripley. Oh, I mean, Goodwill. I remember Goodwill Hunting coming out. I remember when those two were upstarts. Matt Damon looks like old Ray Liotta in this
Seriously.
film.
It's so true. It's like Matt Damon just looks like somebody's like old dad, and you're just
He's
like, oh God, have we all aged horribly? Like, how long has it been?
I mean, at least it's self-reflexive enough that they're like, "Do you work out?" And he's like, "No,
Yeah,
I just came back from jogging."
yeah, totally.
But it's
I
like,
love
"Oh God, I
the
feel
scene
so
where he
old."
tries to jog and he's just like, nah. I'm like, that is the most relatable scene in any movie, where it's like, all right, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go. He's on the track, he's ready to roll. He gets like maybe 10 feet and then he's like, nah. And I'm like,
True.
yep, that's me. That is me
Yeah.
every time I try to work out. The not showing Michael Jordan thing was really distracting for sure.
Yeah.
And it was weird because it was almost like, well, you just don't have to like shoot it from this angle.
Hmm.
You don't have
Exactly.
to include it. That was what was so strange about it. And I think Ben Affleck is a really competent director. I
Yeah.
loved like this movie is not long, it doesn't drag, and that is something to be said at this
Hmm.
point, because I feel like every time you do these kind of biopic type of movies, it becomes like a 2.5 hour like, let's talk about every important moment in this person's life. And this felt really like tight and snappy. It was very like economy of storytelling,
Yeah.
like let's go through this quickly. So I think that was great. But there were some choices that I thought were so weird. And that boardroom scene where we're seeing Michael Jordan, but he keeps sort of turning away, and it's like, well, then just don't shoot him from that angle. Like,
Yeah.
I would have just kind of been like, all right, place the camera behind him, have him sit down in the boardroom, and then let's get on with it.
I mean, it's a lose-lose situation because I'm the first person to admit if they have an actor there who doesn't look like Michael Jordan, I'm going to be going, well, that doesn't look like Michael Jordan.
Yeah,
It's like, oh, that pulls me out of the frame too. So
totally.
it's a lose-lose situation for the film. But yeah, how I thought that was handled was really strange.
Yeah, it was a very weird choice. I like the idea of focusing on his parents, particularly
Mhm.
his mother. I think that was a really smart decision because it's not really a movie about Michael Jordan. He's basically a kid at this point. So
Mhm.
these decisions are not really his decisions anyway. I mean, Viola Davis to me is so impressive in that she was doing this very like soft-spoken, very like nurturing, kind of tender persona, but also really strong behind it. I think we tend to have this thing with like good acting where it just means being really quiet and then yelling. And I
Yeah.
love that with Viola Davis, it was like, no, she doesn't need to do like big yelling. This isn't like a full snot crying performance.
Yeah.
This is just a performance where she gets to have this really like quiet strength, particularly in there's a scene where she's negotiating with Matt Damon and she's like, we want 1% of the shoes sold. And
Mhm.
he's like, that's crazy. We don't do that. That's not a thing. And the way she kind of makes that argument of like, well, this is what we want. And this is, it's very soft. It's very like, it's a very light kind of way that she's speaking, but it's also very like, no, this is what he deserves. And that's what he will get.
She's
And
comfortable riding the pause.
yeah, and it was excellent. That to me was probably my favorite scene,
Mhm.
just because she just really killed it. Like it was I just wanted to watch her. And he picks these
Yeah.
really tight close-ups of her and I was just like so drawn in. I was like, this is great. Like I love seeing her do this. And I wish we had had a little more of that. It was a
Yeah.
little heavy on like Matt Damon's a gambler and he does this
Yeah.
and he blah 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 and all these things. It was kind of like we probably could have lost a little bit of that and focused a little more on the later part with the Jordans and
Mhm.
negotiations and those type of things. But yeah, I think the early parts with leading up to like this is the state of Nike basketball at this point. It's
Mhm.
grim. This is the state of the NBA at this point. I mean, I think it's hard for people, like even in our age group, to picture sort of an NBA pre-Michael Jordan. He was
Yeah. Oh
so
yeah.
formative. Like you said, the dream team years. I think for everybody in our age group, it's like that's what you remember.
Yep.
You remember Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and Hakeem Olajuwon and like
Yep.
you remember these guys because it's like that was like basketball was pop culture in the 90s, you
Mhm.
know? So
I
I
watched
get the
Space Jam.
importance. Exactly. I mean, who in our generation didn't watch Space Jam a million times,
Yeah.
And people can argue whatever they want about whoever is the greatest player of all time. I think for people in our demographic, it's got to be Michael Jordan. Maybe for younger
Mhm.
people it's LeBron, maybe for people it's Kobe. Those are all valid answers, but I feel like for a whole generation of people, it's Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
So I think the choice to not have him in this was the correct choice because having
Mhm.
him be a character with a speaking role and all that, you immediately, like you said, would get taken out of it. If that guy doesn't look like Michael Jordan, that doesn't sound like Michael Jordan, you would be taken out. But then make the focus more on his mom, make the
Yeah.
focus more on that. Viola,
I
I
think that's
wish,
where it comes down to.
yeah, I wish we could have just had a whole movie about Viola Davis because I loved her so much. What did you think of? There was a lot of songs and the needle drops in this movie
Mhm.
were like packed, and I think part of me was like, do they not have confidence that we're going to go with them on the movie, so they have to keep putting in like, but here's a song you like,
It
and
was
we're on board.
distracting. I
Mm-hmm.
thought. I mean, I was going, wow, this is a killer soundtrack. But then it got to the point where I was like, okay, banger after banger after banger.
Yeah,
It was like a quiet moment of like Matt Damon sitting there answering a phone, and it was like killer song came up. It's like,
totally.
okay, you're almost distracting me with your songs.
Yeah.
This song doesn't work here.
It didn't go like full Stranger Things, like here's 80s nostalgia and here's, like it didn't lean as heavy onto that as I feel like we get in a lot of like the
Mhm.
pop culture-y, like here's the 80s. I think also it was really funny in my screening, there was a woman that was sitting in the same row as me and every time a song came on, she would start singing the song like as if it was a sing-along. And it got to the point where every time a song came on, I would start laughing because I knew she was gonna start singing it. So like they got to Time After Time, and I'm like, oh God. And she's literally like, da, 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 da. And I'm like, oh my God. Like not quietly. She was like humming it first, then she started kind of going like da 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 da, and then she was just fully singing the lyrics to these songs. And I just wanted to be like, this is not Rocky Horror, ma'am. This is not an audience participation type of film. You can enjoy the songs, but could you internalize that enjoyment a little bit?
Quietly, boogie quietly,
exactly.
like
dance around in your seat or something, like tap your toes or whatever. This isn't a full sing-along experience. And so in that sense, the needle drops were even more distracting for me, but it made me think, is that kind of what they want? This audience kind of like, hey, I know that song. I love that song. And I want it to be like, Ben, your movie's good enough.
Yeah.
You don't need it.
He has showed he's a confident director. He's a solid filmmaker. And I think that's the next evolution of his career. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you had said it almost reeks of not quite having the confidence. And this movie, it's like Tetris. It was almost there. Mm-hmm. A few other tweaks, and I think the music is there almost to distract a little bit, because it's like one hit wonder after one, hit after hit after hit, and it just not few less, and you'd be fine. It'd be just as good.
The one that I felt like I was like, what are you doing, Ben? Was they used that Chicago Bulls like intro song. It's like an Alan Parsons Project song. And that to me is like, again, as a person in my generation, I hear that like dun 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 dun, like, and I'm immediately like, oh my God, Chicago Bulls, here we go. Like I just hear like the announcer being like, at 6'6" from North Carolina, Michael Jordan. So it's like, to me, like I immediately hear that in my brain, and they use that at a moment in this that I was like, it's not majestic enough for the use of that song. I would have used that song when they come in the boardroom, and maybe that's fan service and maybe that's too on the nose. But I think when they first come in the boardroom and we're seeing Michael Jordan enter the Nike offices, that's probably when I would have used that song, as opposed to kind of in a moment where I think it's used for Ben Affleck's character. He's like kind of, I think it's basically like him sort of deciding that he's going to back this.
Oh, where he was on his little run in his pink leggings. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it was used for basically, which is an important moment of him deciding, yes, I'm on board with this idea. But I can't associate that with anything except introducing Michael Jordan. So I'm like, so use it for introducing Michael Jordan.
Well, this film doesn't exist without, I mean, we said Michael Jordan isn't, a 20-year-old kid at this point. We keep hearing he's a skinny 20-year-old kid. This film does not exist without Michael Jordan's legacy of what he is now. The boardroom scene knows this. That speech Matt Damon gives is specifically reliant on, we know who Michael Jordan becomes. Yeah. This film is happening because Michael Jordan is who Michael Jordan is.
Totally.
But yet, all of this is given to, this whole thing is focusing on Matt and Ben. And I mean, Matt and Ben are a legendary film pair. And I think that's really the flaw, struggle. I mean, pick your word. They're working so hard to make Matt Damon the focus there. Yeah. And it should be Viola.
I liked Matt Damon's speech about legacy and the immortality of being famous and having this legacy of your brand and all that stuff. But it was a little like, it almost was like he was going to turn to the camera and go,
to me.
Like, everyone, take a look at your feet. Everyone sitting in the theater watching this, how many of you are wearing Jordans right now? Like, it just felt like a little like, yeah, we get it, but I think it works. To me, it's like, this is a movie where like dads are going to love this movie. Yeah. Not just my dad. My dad is obviously going to love this movie. My dad's going to be all about this. I literally texted him when I got out, was like, oh, dude, you are going to love this movie. And I'm sure he will. But I think like dads in general, people that are like our age, a little bit older, that are like into this kind of thing, I think they'll be very much about it because it does tap into this period of time with basketball where basketball was very exciting.
I wonder how much of this is purely to tackle this. They're going, oh, what's an easy way to tackle millennial nostalgia? Everybody wore Air Jordans.
Yeah, totally.
Everybody wanted them. Just throw a few bangers and a few footage of, where's the beef in there, and it'll. Yeah. I saw the Arthur Ashe commercial in there. I was like, whoa.
Yeah. But that's what I do like about this, though. It is real 80s, like the Arthur Ashe commercial is not a commercial that's like being talked about all the time. And people are not like, oh, that commercial that everyone remembers, the Arthur Ashe commercial. But that's what I mean about it's real 80s. Like that's the real shit that you used to see. It wasn't all like, pop culture madness. It was like things like that only actual people who were there kind of remember that, or people who are a little bit younger and kind of remember when those things were still airing on TV.
It's like watching late night TV on your wood panel TV and see.
Exactly. I wonder how, like, I'm curious to see if streaming is where this now all goes. And of course, I think if that is the case, budgets are going to start to shrink. So we're going to have to get filmmakers who are able to do more with less. And I think there are tons of filmmakers who can do that, who are like not interested in making a $300 million movie, but who can make a really effective and efficient smaller film. Like I love, there's things on Netflix, there's things on Prime and all that I really love. And I'm like, these are great, like grown-up movies. And if the only way to see those is on streamers, I hope that streamers are still invested in doing stuff like that. And I Amazon, they have all the money in the world. Apple has all the money in the world. They can easily do these things. But I wonder about something like Netflix that's constantly trying to kind of struggle with like a Red Notice, but then they also want to have something that's smaller and meaningful. Like, where do they go with it? Because I feel like there is a market for watching these things on streaming, but will they put the money out for something like that, especially if it's not necessarily a full like Oscar bait thing?
Amazon Prime is showing a lot of patience. This was an Amazon film. It didn't get the love it deserved, but I thought My Policeman was beautiful. They're really comfortable with quiet, simple adult dramas. Apple's doing some interesting, quirky stuff. Tetris, but then they've got some weird TV shows that I know I'm not necessarily caught up on, but they're allowing some interesting ideas to come forward that gives me hope.
Yeah.
But Netflix, you've got the Red Notice of it all. You've got the Kevin Hart of it all. You've got they're questing for the fast buck.
It's so funny because that's where I'm like, okay, do your Red Notice, do your, many Chris Hemsworth things or whatever, and then take the money and do more stuff like Rana Naidu, which I love. And like, I'm like, that did really well. Maybe we'll get a second season, but will we get 5 seasons? Probably not, because Netflix notoriously is like, 2 seasons, you're done. I think Netflix is trying to be too many things to too many people.
Yeah.
And they kind of have to at this point. They don't have the backup of having an amusement park or having, iPads or all those things. So it's like, I get that they're like, this has to be their revenue thing. But I hope that streamers are aware that like there is a market for these movies for grown-ups. People want to see them. And if maybe the budgets have to be smaller, but like if you let it happen, if you put some effort into that, like an audience will grow, because there is a thirst for more than just ginormous blockbusters.
Netflix, we said, I think it was last week, they're doing amazing work with outside the US content. In terms of the streamers, what they're doing with the European content, the Asian content, they're bringing a lot of the stuff there that we would not get otherwise without going to more niche streamers, which is great.
Well, I think, the state of movies, we'll see how this goes. I think both of us are, maybe we're in a weird group too, because we're like film nerds. We're people who like dramas. We're people who like these things. And maybe the average person is like, I want to eat popcorn and see explosions. And that's fine. That's fine if that's what you're into. You can like those things
raved
too.
about John Wick last week. I love a good popcorn film, but there's more to, we need dramas. We need, maybe we're both writers. I don't know, but we like character. We like story.
So much of it too is just like expanding your horizons as a viewer. If the only thing you're able to see is like, the 6 superhero movies every year, like you're not going to really experience a wider variety of film.
Yep.
And there's so many great things. It shouldn't just be Oscar time when everyone goes, oh, let's all see these, smaller things. Yeah, let's go watch a drama. It should be throughout the year because these things get released throughout the year and they're so great. And it's like, oh, please, let's get attention to these. And yeah, they're hard to find, and your multiplex is filled with whatever the latest Disney product is. But it's like, there are these little small things. Try to find them, try to go see them, try to watch them when they hit streaming, because we could save movies, everyone. We could have these things again.
There's worthwhile performances. There's good talent. Come on.
Totally. I think that's a good episode. It's a good starting or stopping point for this episode. And I think next week we will be talking about the Mario movie. So that should be interesting. We will have all that coming up on the next episode. And for now, like, share, subscribe, all the things. Follow us on the socials. Links are in the description for our reviews of Tetris and Dungeons and Dragons. I think we'll probably have our Air reviews in there too or something. But we'll see. So anyway, links in the description for all that stuff. And thank you so much for watching, and we will catch you in the next one.